It's on.
Starting.
I'm getting somewhere.
I'm upside down.
It's upside down?
I think it
I want to
is.
flip the camera.
I think.
Turning Hegel on his head. Alright, you good?
Yeah.
Alright, so we don't have a lot of people for this meeting. Right now it's just Race, Nick, who's manning the camera and the laptop, and I. But hopefully
Victor. That's Victor, not Nick.
Same
Victor, not
thing.
Nick. I'm sorry, I get you two confused all the time. But I wanted to start with some announcements of stuff that's been going on for the past few weeks. One, I want to talk about the marches and protests that I personally attended, and they were the only ones I knew about. But there was the march Workers' Dignity had for hotel workers who had been denied the pay they deserved or had been worked excruciatingly long hours, and I would say it was very successful. It was one of the more uplifting marches I've been a part of, to where probably between 30 and 50 people showed up. People had banners, people had music. It was just very well organized and put together, and not a lot went wrong. But the other one I went to was the Vengeance Strength, whatever, cult with a V, gym, white supremacist gym that's set up now, and the counter-protest for it went well for about the first 90%, and then some guy in a Guy Fawkes mask pulled out a knife after someone got their Antifa flag stolen, and the media caught that on camera. So just another example of why discipline is good, and why you really don't want to pull a knife out at a protest that people are putting on
Let them attack you
peacefully. Yeah, well, honestly, yeah, like defending yourself, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, the media will still spin that the other way, but still, defend yourself. But this was a protest surge put together. They wanted it to be peaceful. It's not like this was, you know, a group that was set on being militant. And this is just a good example of why revolutionary discipline is important.
Mm-hmm.
Why you need to not go in guns blazing. So that was that. Some of the big things going on right now is we, meaning Race, Victor, Nick, Michaela, and I are a part of the leadership for the Nashville chapter, I guess you would call it, of the People's Congress of Resistance. And if you don't know what that is basically a system of dual power that's being set up. I think I touched on the concept of dual power in the first meeting, where it's the idea of once the masses have rejected the official authority, the state power that has been set up, they look for an alternate solution. And in this case, it's supposed to be the People's Congress. So it's got representatives from PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. It's got Black Lives Matter's representatives and the American Indian Movement representatives. And the big thing that's going on with that is that on the weekend of September 16th to 17th, Saturday and Sunday, there's going to be a convention, basically a meeting of the Congress in DC, where all the people are going to voice what's on their mind and their needs of their local communities, all that fun stuff. And our job right now is to communicate with local people and the local organizations to find out what is something we don't have down that we need to have down. And we're going to be having meetings, weekly meetings, on Friday or Saturday for the People's Congress, mostly for outreach. It'd be great for anyone to attend, but right now it's just calling people, trying to get people to come to the convention that's going to happen in September. So that's what I can say about that right now. You can go to their website. I think it's just congressofresistance.com or .org, one of those. And you can register to go. There is a fee, but they have options for lower income people to be able to go without having to pay a high fee. So if you want to go, definitely hit us up about that. There's supposed to be a caravan coming through that we're going to take just before it happens. So, yeah. On top of that, Nick has been has wisely set up a tutoring program where he's trying to reach out to schools, especially in lower income areas, and have some of us volunteer to tutor. I've already pledged that, yeah, I can volunteer to tutor at times, and we're certain that other people will be able to as well. And I wanted to talk about something that happened recently where a young man who's now 19 years old, but at the time of the event was 18, Jordan Norris, was tortured in police custody in Cheatham County, tased for 50 seconds, and was found to have 40 burns on his body. So it was obvious that it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was something that had been going on for a while. And really, the question I propose is, what groups should we contact for that? I know Nick was talking about talking to a connection he has with prisoners' rights, but I haven't heard back from him on that. And I have to ask, what can we do as a movement in organizing this? Is there any way we can set up some kind of protest or march against the police officers who they're on administrative leave right now? And if that's all they get, that will be absolutely ridiculous, but hopefully it's not. Upcoming events. Now, this is what I know of. I don't know if you two know of anything else, but the League of Women Voters of Nashville is setting up an event called Hot Topics for Richer for Poorer, the Money Bail System, which is going to be on Tuesday, August 9th from 6 to 7 p.m. at the Green Hills Library. I know that Workers' Dignity has meetings every Thursday at 7 p.m. where you can volunteer to help them. And yeah, that's all I know. Do you two know anything going on?
I haven't heard anything other than that. I'd seen posts about that, but that's all I've really been keeping heard.
Workers' Dignity has a radio show now.
That's true. Yeah, check out Workers' Dignity Radio. And yeah, so one other thing I wanted to mention, and this is not to open old wounds or cause a ruckus, but it is something that I feel responsible for and that needs to be said, and it's addressing behavior in the group and attitudes. Basically, our policy with this group is we'll accept anyone, as long as you're not just a horrible person, of any political view, but the group is specifically Marxist-Leninist. It was organized along that lines. That doesn't mean you have to be one to be in it, but that's how it goes. And as such, we are dialecticians. The point of any conversation or debate is to discuss and try to come to some kind of synthesis, some kind of truth. You make your point, you hear the counterpoint, if you can't come up with a point to counter that, you can concede, and there's no shame in that, or you can admit you need to look into it more. But I didn't feel the need to say this before because I didn't think it would need to be said, but I won't tolerate trolling, and I don't think anybody else who's a full member feels differently in regards to that. This is not a meme group. You can go and do that in any meme group you want, but not here. This is for discussion and for learning, especially. And we have the quote from Marx in his early days where he said, "If constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be. Not just conflict with the powers that be, but conflict with each other, because that's how you arrive at, as Marxist-Leninists believe, an objective truth for a given situation and condition." So I wanted to address that to make sure we don't have that problem again. But our next meeting, and this is what I'm proposing for our next meeting, I don't know what everyone else feels, we've been contacted, actually our contact with the People's Congress of Resistance, who was one of the leaders, or is one of the leaders for the Nashville branch, is now moving. He and two of the other leaders in the People's Congress of Resistance in Nashville are members of PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and Timur, one of the said leaders, had offered that we could end up starting our own chapter of that, or having this morph into something like that. They have pretty much the exact same goals we have. My biggest concern, and this is why I think it would be important to discuss it, which is why I hope at the next meeting we have as many members as possible there, would be how open it would be. I'm sure that they are fine with people who are not dedicated party members coming to meetings to learn and join the party. How else are they going to do it? But I can see obvious benefits. One being having a national organization, being a part of that, having that back you up, having that give you advice and guidance. I can see possible negatives with that, being with difference in ideology, but I can't find anything significant in regards to that right now. We have our stated strategy and goals on the page, on the group page right now, and it's basically the exact same for PSL, and basically the exact same for Workers' World Party and for FRSO, or at least one of the Freedom Road Socialist organizations, because there's two of them now. So yeah, that's something for the next meeting. Also at the next meeting, if we decide negatively on that, or if we decide to push that decision back to a later date, I would suggest that the full members discuss drafting an outline for some kind of a more comprehensive manifesto, as opposed to just the strategies and goals that we have laid out. Something that if someone sees the strategies and goals that we have and they say, hey, this is cool, do you have anything deeper to talk about why, or maybe they don't go along with it and they're confused by what we mean or why we're doing this, we can say, hey, check this out, or read this page on this, and we've pretty much laid out our position on that. And thirdly, I would want the next meeting to involve discussing positions in the group, because right now there hasn't been any kind of organization in regards to who has a certain position in one way or another, and we've avoided that out of a sense of wanting to get more and more members to decide who's doing what democratically, but we may have to set up something provisionally with the few full members that we have right now, deciding on that. But discussing positions is important. It's good to know who is in charge of what, communication, etc., outreach, etc., and that's something I think we need to address. Okay.
Delineating of labor.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's what we have for that. Now on to the main point, which is what I wanted to start with is religion, because I felt like I had asked when I posted what does everybody want to see in the next meeting, a list of things including religion, women's rights, and LGBT rights, and I thought, why don't we just push these all together, because I feel like we could get religion we can get out of the way real quick. I don't think we could have a very long discussion on Marxism and religion, really. It's actually quite simple.
I mean, we can ruthlessly criticize absolutely everything.
Yeah, that's true, exactly. But there's because really, from reading Marx, I was reading Marx, Engels, and Lenin for this and looking for answers, and it's really quite simple. And most people who think of Marxism and religion, they know the famous quotes, and I'll read the whole thing here. Religious suffering is at one time, this is Marx, by the way, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. That is the line that most, especially new atheists now, just isolate it, pull it out, and take it out of context. Continuing that quote, the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is, therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. And that's basically a long and pretty poetic, especially Marx in his early days tended to do that, way of saying religion isn't the source of the problems involving religions, it's the material conditions that bring forth the religions. It's the class struggle, it's the contradictions within society. So that quote actually comes from, as far as I'm aware, Marx criticizing Feuerbach, who was a young Hegelian. Was that his position? Yeah, he was a radical liberal who thought that religion was the prime enemy of society, of any thinking society. So he attacked religion constantly. And Marx was basically saying, you're missing the point. It's not, you're being idealistic in what you're doing. You're focusing on something that exists in the realm of ideas as opposed to what actually has an effect on the earth. You have where, in the Marxist view, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, they were all atheists. We know this. That doesn't mean you have to be an atheist to be a communist, and I'll get to that later with Lenin. They all saw religion as being made by mankind. So the question is, how do they make that, or why do they make it as such? And in this sense, it is due to the material conditions. So under capitalism, the people suffer from things they do not understand. They can't answer the questions too fully. And the idea that Marx and Engels and Lenin and all of them shared was that once society has surpassed capitalism and we have come to a point where it is basically a communist society, religion will fade away naturally. If you disagree with that, that's perfectly fine. It's not really something that's major contention with Marx. It's like, if the theory is correct, it will, bless you, it will prove itself to be correct. And Engels echoed the same sentiment as Marx in criticizing the idealist petty bourgeois criticism of religion in Anti-Dühring. I was actually reading the book just to read it. I didn't expect to come across anything with religion, but Dühring, who had come up with his own really bizarre version of communism during the 1860s and 70s, was being criticized by Engels. And one of the things Dühring said was basically they needed to declare war on religion. They needed to attack it because it's making the people ignorant, it's making them support the old system, the old society. Engels has the quote, in response to this, he out-Bismarcks Bismarck. He decrees sharper May laws not merely against Catholicism, but against all religion whatsoever. And what he's referring to by that is the May laws in the German Empire, which suppressed the Catholic Church, and specifically the Center Party, which was aligned with the Catholic Church. And the results of this were less a movement away from Catholicism and more of a major defense of Catholicism. It was putting it on the spot, and it had the opposite of results of what Bismarck wanted. So all it did was continue the religious struggle further and heightened it. So by ignoring the material conditions and focusing on it as basically the new atheist idea of, oh, people are just stupid, that's why they believe in religion, we're going to enlighten them, which that has no basis in material conditions whatsoever. That's idealism to a T, basically. And Engels has this quote to continue: "It is still true that man proposes and God, that is, the alien domination of the capitalist mode of production, disposes. Mere knowledge, even if it went much further and deeper than that of bourgeois economic science, is not enough to bring social forces under the domination of society. What is above all necessary for this is a social act, and when this act has been accomplished, when society, by taking possession of all means of production and using them on a planned basis, has freed itself and all its members from the bondage in which they are now held by these means of production, which they themselves have produced, but which confront them as an irresistible alien force, when therefore man no longer merely proposes, but also disposes, only then will the last alien force which is still reflected in religion vanish, and with it will also vanish the religious reflection itself, for the simple reason that there will be nothing left to reflect." So that's the whole idea, where you can't attack an idea like religion from a materialist standpoint, because it's two completely separate things, more or less. So you have to attack the material conditions that bring forth this idea. And maybe if one of the religions turns out to be true, then the material conditions will go along with that. That's the thing. Marxists would obviously accept if there were proof of a god or some kind of spiritual force. They would, if there was scientific proof of that, they would accept it. Maybe not immediately, but at a point they would accept it. That's why Marxists are materialists. That materialism is a science in itself. So the belief in Marxism is that the abolition of class society will cause the withering away of religion, as it cannot be abolished simply by decree, because it arises out of material conditions. It's much like what I said in the first meeting about the state. It's not something that you can simply will away, or that you can pass laws against and have that be truly forceful, because obviously the Russian Orthodox Church has a lot of sway in Russia right now, and in different communist countries, the churches still have much power and influence. So, Vladimir Lenin, although in his writings it would be easy to look at some of the things he says and get really that kind of new atheist vibe that I was talking about needing to avoid, where he's very ruthlessly criticizing, as we talked about, religion. But he says, "The Russian Revolution must put this demand into effect as a necessary component of political freedom. In this respect, the Russian Revolution is in a particularly favorable position, since the revolting officialism of the police-ridden feudal autocracy has called forth discontent, unrest, and indignation even among the clergy. However abject, however ignorant Russian Orthodox clergymen may have been, even they have now been awakened by the thunder of the downfall of the old medieval order in Russia. Even they are joining in the demand for freedom, are protesting against bureaucratic practices and officialism, against the spying for the police imposed on the servants of God. We socialists must lend this movement our support, carrying the demands of honest and sincere members of the clergy to their conclusion, making them stick to their words about freedom, demanding that they should resolutely break all ties between religion and the police. Either you are sincere, in which case you must stand for the complete separation of church and state, and of school and church, for religion to be declared wholly and absolutely a private affair, or you do not accept these consistent demands for freedom, in which case you evidently are still held captive by the traditions of the Inquisition, in which case you evidently still cling to your cozy government jobs and government-derived incomes, in which case you evidently do not believe in the spiritual power of your weapon and continue to take bribes from the state. And in that case, the class-conscious workers of all Russia declare merciless war on you. So, right there, he's saying we want allies in the clergy. We want people who are particularly religious but are against the state apparatus, who we can find, as I said, an alliance with, a common ground with, to work with. We do not expel them from the party. There's, let me check over this real quick. Well, this is just a good quote to follow up on that before I say more. Our program is, from Lenin again, our program is based entirely on the scientific and, moreover, the materialist world outlook. An explanation of our program, therefore, necessarily indulges an explanation of the true historical and economic roots of the religious fog. Our propaganda necessarily includes the propaganda of atheism, or what really, when you look at the time that this was being written, agnosticism and atheism. I remember reading in the introduction to Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, Engels talks about the importance of agnosticism being introduced to science, to where they remove religion from the factor. I think that's more of what Lenin is talking about when he talks about the propaganda of atheism. The publication, he says, our propaganda necessarily includes the propaganda of atheism, the publication of the appropriate scientific literature, which the autocratic feudal government has hitherto strictly forbidden and persecuted, must now form one of the fields of our party work. We shall now probably have to follow the advice Engels once gave to the German socialists, to translate and widely disseminate the literature of the 18th century French enlighteners and atheists. But under no circumstances ought we to fall into the error of posing the religious question in an abstract, idealistic fashion as an intellectual question unconnected with the class struggle, once again talking about idealism versus materialism, as is not infrequently done by the radical Democrats from among the bourgeoisie. It would be stupid to think that in a society based on the endless oppression and coarsening of the worker masses, religious prejudices could be dispelled by purely propaganda methods. It would be bourgeois narrow-mindedness to forget that the yoke of religion that weighs upon mankind is merely a product and reflection of the economic yoke within society. No number of pamphlets and no amount of preaching can enlighten the proletariat, if it is not enlightened by its own struggle against the dark forces of capitalism. Unity in this really revolutionary struggle of the oppressed class for the creation of a paradise on earth is more important to us than unity of proletarian opinion on paradise in heaven. So, once again, that last sentence really lays it out. It's something that just isn't a priority for the proletarian movement. It's something that is a minor difference in most cases, at least in regards to proletarians who feel the need to, who have the class consciousness and have the understanding of class society to break free from it. It's not something that's that big of a deal. So he goes on to say, that is the reason why we do not and should not set forth our atheism in our program. That is why we do not and should not prohibit proletarians who still retain vestiges of their old prejudices from associating themselves with our party. We shall always preach the scientific world outlook, and it is essential for us to combat the inconsistency of various Christians, but that does not mean in the least that the religious question ought to be advanced to first place, where it does not belong at all, nor does it mean that we should allow the forces of the really revolutionary economic and political struggle to be split up on account of third-rate opinions or senseless ideas, rapidly losing all political importance, rapidly being swept out as rubbish by the very discourse of economic development. I think that quote alone is sufficient in and of itself to describe what a modern Marxist movement should look like. It's not even a part of the party program. It's not a part of the question. It's connected, as all things are, but it's irrelevant in its connection and the way we address it. So he continues, everywhere the reactionary bourgeoisie has concerned itself, and is now beginning to concern itself in Russia, with the fermenting of religious strife, in order thereby to divert the attention of the masses from the really important and fundamental economic and political problems now being solved in practice by the all-Russian proletariat uniting in revolutionary struggle. This reactionary policy of splitting up the proletarian forces, which today manifests itself mainly in Black Hundred pogroms, may tomorrow conceive some more subtle forms. We at any rate shall oppose it by calmly, consistently, and patiently preaching proletarian solidarity and the scientific world outlook, a preaching alien to any stirring up of secondary differences. He mentions the Black Hundreds there, just to give historical context. The Black Hundreds were groups of fervently religious, fervently pro-czarist monarchists, I guess you could say, who would go out and commit pogroms and kill people and commit horrible atrocities. And they were backed by the Tsar. The Tsar considered them his best loyal followers. And that's just not just communist propaganda, if you want to call it that. I read that in a liberal textbook about the Russian Revolution. So the revolutionary proletariat will succeed in making religion a really private affair, so far as the state is concerned. And in this political system, cleansed of medieval mildew, the proletariat will wage a broad and open struggle for the elimination of economic slavery, the true source of the religious humbugging of mankind. So that's the general consensus that Marxists have in regards to religion, that it's irrelevant in a way. But there's also a lot of modern movements have proven that religion doesn't have to take on a necessarily oppressive stance. It can be liberating and a part of motivation for the struggle. Although it arises out of the material conditions, well, that itself basically explains it. If you have a community that is living in horrible conditions, and there is a religion specific to it, that religion is going to come from those material conditions and affect their outlook on the world and lead to liberation and revolution. And we have plenty of examples of that with liberation theology in Latin America, where you have Marxists who are motivated by the church and by their Christianity to thinking, I can't remember what the term is called, but it's basically the idea that Jesus favored the poor, and they are to...
it turns Christianity into a revolutionary science.
Right, yeah. And in relation to that, it's actually interesting. I read Engels's essay on early Christianity, which actually relates the socialist movement to early Christianity's revolutionary potential. And most of it is more historical than political. It's talking about like the origins of certain texts in the Bible. It's quite interesting, but the earlier part had a funny moment where it talks about how there was a Christian preacher or priest or whatever you want to call him who would go around and wrote about his troubles getting donations, and he was like, hey, we're having the same problem, like getting dues paid in our unions and in our workers' organizations. It's like we would have shook hands and been friends and just talked about all the problems we're having in our revolutionary struggle, because he talked about while Christianity remained against the state apparatus and while it hadn't been absorbed into in his view, the Greco-Roman world and been morphed from that. It was a revolutionary movement that organized itself into collective communes where people cared for each other, and in slave societies. I had read a book called, I think it's just called The History of Christianity, which admits that it is a non-typical view, I guess, or a typical account of the history of Christianity. But it claimed that it wasn't the slaves who tended to go towards Christianity. It was more the townspeople, the townsfolk who were grouped together. But that doesn't change the fact that the ideology proposed clearly has a more supportive stance in regards to the lower classes than the previous religion. You have where there's charity and care for the sick and for the needy, and a sense of brotherly love for everyone in your community, as opposed to what existed before. So even though it may have attracted more of the townspeople as opposed to the slaves, you can see why it's considered something that is, as, if I'm not mistaken, as Nietzsche would think of it, as being slave morality. So it's all about the class that the movement has its interests vested in, not who has the most support from this class. It's all, that's why, like, with Marxist movements, even if a movement doesn't have the majority support from a class, it still, if its interests are in that direction, then it will naturally overcome the obstacles, and when the conditions are right, the working class will support it, and the revolutionary masses. Now, going beyond that, you have Malcolm X, who his faith in Islam motivated his sense of rights for black people in the United States and rights for black nationalism. And nationalism in general tends to have a, religion tends to play a role in that in a lot of movements, to where they look at it as being a part of their liberation struggle. But we even have the quote from Lenin talking about an oppressed group in Russia. He says, "Muslims of Russia, all you whose mosques and prayer houses have been destroyed, whose beliefs and customs have been trampled upon by the czars and oppressors of Russia, your beliefs and practices, your national and cultural institutions are forever free and inviolate. Know that your rights, like those of all the people of Russia, are under the mighty protection of the revolution." So, in regards to where we are now, we have to avoid the holier-than-thou attitude. Not because we're trying to avoid hurting people's feelings. We're communists. We're obviously going to hurt a lot of people's feelings in regards to class stance. That's simply how it goes. We have our views and our scientific analyses. But it's because it is a distraction from the struggle itself. It's secondary. It has nothing to do with the primary contradiction in regards to the class struggle between the proletariat and the capitalist class. So, but on top of that, Marxist-Leninists must wholeheartedly support science and scientific advancement. And that, in and of itself, you can decide, once again, as they all said, privately, you can decide whether that goes with your religion or not. But as a party, or as any party, it has to be atheist in the sense that one's religion is not brought into the discussion to influence the scientific analysis. If in your private life it works together, that's great, but you can't have, like, where the Republican Party or even the Democratic Party will use their faith to try to influence the masses or an idea. It gets messy when you do that, and it gets subversive. So that's all I really have to say on religion. Do you have anything to add?
Nope, you covered all the bases that I would have wanted to cover anyway.
Yeah. Any questions? Anything along that line?
Is there anyone on in the chat?
There's one.
That's probably you.
They'll watch later.
Yeah, sure. But, alright. Moving on from religion and Marxism, we have women's rights in Marxism, and specifically women's rights in Marxist states. But first, I wanted to talk about where I first saw Marx talk about women's rights, and that was in Capital Volume 1 specifically. He talks about women and children being brought into the labor force and being horrifically exploited. But he mentions that this is a catalyst for the possibility of a new social position for women in society. It brings about the conditions necessary to where women and men are both in the workplace. They're both given roles in the production in society. It's taking women out of the house where they've been for hundreds of years. And it's no coincidence, I would say, that the feminist movement came about along with the rise of capitalism. That's the material conditions that led to it. So, as such, Marxists, or as they called themselves at the time, scientific socialists, supported women in the workplace. However, as I've already said in the first meeting, the early anarchists like Proudhon and later Bakunin did not, as they wished to return to a small owner type of libertarian society, which was mostly motivated by the petty bourgeois skilled laborers who were losing their jobs to women and children working on the machines that allowed them to do what once only the very skilled technical laborers could do. So this is what led to the split of the First International Association of Workers, or it was one of the contributing factors that led to the split of the First International. But more interesting just topics to bring up. International Working Women's Day was March 8th, was originally celebrated by socialists worldwide, and it was even the catalyst for the first stage of the Russian Revolution, the February Revolution, where women went out and demonstrated against the Tsar and his policies, and they were later supported by the mass of workers and soldiers in the area. And this brought about the first taste of democracy in Russia. And along with that, International Working Women's Day first became an official state holiday in the Soviet Union, and eventually come to all communist countries. Funny enough, after the fall of the USSR, the UN removed the working part of the title to just make it International Women's Day, as they saw it as too divisive. They wanted to make it more broad, which I kind of understand that women as an entire group, no matter what class, face issues that men do not. But it's taking away the fact that its whole purpose was to unite working women. Proletarian women. So, I mostly, or pretty much only focus on the Soviet Union in my topic regards to early socialist feminism, because I think it was the example followed by every other Marxist-Leninist country, and most of them had similar results to what the Soviet Union had. So we have a quote from Alexandra Kollontai, who, she was I think the second woman in the world to be given a high position in a cabinet. I can't remember what her position was. I know she was it Minister of Education? It was something along those lines. Yeah, I'm not sure, but she was given a very high position, and her quote was, "A great deal of attention has been given to the organization of public canteens, kindergartens, young pioneer camps, playgrounds, and creches, those institutions which, as Lenin wrote, facilitate in practice the emancipation of women and are able in practice to reduce the female inequality vis-a-vis men. More than 7,000 women's and children's consultation centers have been established in the USSR, of which half are in rural areas. Over 20,000 crèches have been organized. It should be pointed out here that in Tsarist Russia, in 1913, there existed only 19 crèches and 25 kindergartens, and even these were not maintained by the state but by philanthropic organization. The Soviet state provides increasing material assistance to mothers. Women women receive allowances and paid leave before and after the birth of the child, and their post is kept open for them until they return from leave. So you can kind of get a sense from this that motherhood was very integral to the early Soviet idea of women's emancipation. They saw it as something unique to women. This is obviously an outdated thought, but at the time it was their position. And what they wanted to do was make it where women could be mothers in society, fulfill their social role as mothers, but also be workers and be a part of the political organization of society, be as equal to men as physically possible under these conditions. That was why you had early on, when the Tsar's laws were abolished, abortion was decriminalized for a period of time. But at the request of the women's committees, it was made illegal again because they believed that the state had already solved the economic problems facing women with the mother of the children. At the time, really in all feminist circles, both in liberal and in socialist, the position on reproductive rights was less about the modern idea of a woman controlling her own body, and more on the idea of economically it is beneficial to poor women who are suffering and dying by not being able to control how many children they have. And so the tie to economic rights was why it was made illegal, because they thought, well, we can have more future proletarians being born and raised into this system. But once the party committed or performed self-criticism, it was able to rectify this in the 50s, and abortion became available again and at an incredibly cheap rate. This is why it's actually one of my favorite maps that points out something just good that communist countries did. It's a map of Europe, and it's by date which countries legalized abortion. And really the only two colors, there are a few others, but the main two colors are blue and red. And blue is in the 1950s. The entire East, from East Germany to the Soviet Union, and south to Bulgaria, is blue. And in the entire West, it's red for the 90s, usually. So you have where there's a 40-year difference. In fact, they would tell stories about how Swedish women who were, neutral, not a part of the Warsaw Pact or NATO, would travel to Poland to get a free abortion. And this was just a common thing that happened. In regards to the government, at one point, women's participation in the Soviet system was 33% of the USSR Supreme Soviet, 36% of Republican-level Supreme Soviets. That means for every individual Soviet republic, they had their own Soviet, and 50% of local Soviets. That is an incredibly impressive amount to have, especially at the time that this was going on. And usually people don't consider the influence that communist countries had on the demand for women's liberation in capitalist countries, where they were seeing these examples of, as the term goes, emancipated women being freed from their duties in the home to enjoy their life and pursue their own careers. And you have the capitalists basically going, well, we've got to put something in place or they're going to start wanting communism. which is why there's so much association with Marxism and feminism nowadays, because it had that origins in Soviet Russia. And at one point, women's participation in the Soviet, or I've already said that, but in World War II, 800,000 women served in the Soviet military, almost 1 million people, and 200,000 received military decorations. You have plenty of examples of famous women who fought to defend their country. You have the Night Witches, who, I love the story of them. They were this bombing unit that was given outdated planes because you could make an argument, obviously, that sexism played a role in that, and it probably did, but they also just had, at the time, not the best equipment, and the German Air Force had almost completely annihilated the Soviet Air Force at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, so they had to rectify that later with production. And what they would do is they used this outdated equipment to their advantage. They would fly in, and when they got close to their targets, they would stall their engines because the biplanes they were flying were able to basically glide on their own, so quietly. So they'd glide into their target, drop the bombs, and then sneak back away. And so the German soldiers dubbed them the Night Witches because they were these sneaky bombers who came in and just surprise attacked them every chance they got. You had the example of Ludmila Pavlichenko, who is the most, I would say, most famous female sniper in history, credited with 309 kills. And she was wounded from mortar fire in a battle, and she ended up being sent to America to raise support for the Soviet war effort and try to get them to open a second front. And while she was there, the media and people she met would criticize her uniform for her skirt being too long or making her look too fat, and she just thought this was completely ridiculous. And you have all these accomplishments that we barely see in modern liberal countries today, and it's fascinating to see it happen as early as the 1940s and 1920s, etc. And in the early 1950s, Alexandra Kollontai wrote, "In a country where 30 years ago, out of 2,300,000 working women, 1,300,000 worked as servants in the towns, and 750,000 as farm laborers in the countryside. In a country where there were almost no women engineers, almost no scientists, an appointment to a teaching post was accompanied by conditions insulting to female dignity. In that country, there are now 750,000 teachers, 100,000 women doctors, and 250,000 women engineers. Women make up 1/2 of the student body in institutions of higher education. Over 33,000 women are working in laboratories and in research institutes. 25,000 women have academic titles and degrees, and 166 women have been awarded the state prize for their achievements in science and work." So that right there is a dramatic change. I remember reading in a book on the Russian Revolution how it talked about women's conditions under the Tsar and under the feudal system, where they just weren't even considered people. They were basically property, or they were property more or less. When they would have the ritual of marriage, they would consummate publicly in front of the village, and if the man, so to speak, couldn't get it up, the village elder would take his place. So it's just these horrible things and these horrible conditions in this existence that they were stuck in. And it always fascinates me because usually, not always, but usually the people who are the most outspoken critics of communism are white men who talk about their freedoms being taken away. And one of the things that really got me on board with communism was thinking, this country gave half its population, over half if you jump in the oppressed nations, greater rights than they had in the United States. But we forget about that because we don't look at the typical woman or the typical oppressed person as being the standard example. We look at the man and what their role is. And yeah, okay, a man couldn't, even saying couldn't is hard to say, but a man would have a harder time setting up their own small business, but half the population had voting rights, or over half the population had voting rights before they did in the United States. Over half the population participated more in government than they did in the United States. Over half the population, I mean, just the picture I posted earlier, not in this event, but the last one, is one of my favorite pieces of Soviet art ever, where it's the little girl and an older scientist, and she's holding a flask and saying, "I will be a chemist." And it's that's in the 1960s. You look at American advertisements in the 1960s, and it's always those examples that people use of just horrible misogyny and just horrible sexism, where it's just a woman's place is in the kitchen and all this stuff. And it's ironic to me that the representation that people, rightfully so, strive for today in art and media was achieved more or less along the same lines so successfully over half a century ago. If you look at any art from the Soviet Union, and you can call it Soviet propaganda all you want, it puts women and oppressed nations at the front, and it represents them very fairly and accurately. I'd be damned to find a piece of art from that time period that had a stereotypical example of an oppressed nationality. Like, you have art where it's all of the nations coming together, and it's really just inspiring. It's very well done propaganda, I will say, in that regards to their position on the oppressed nationalities. And what you have now going on in Russia and in a lot of the former communist countries is really sad in regards to the retraction that's come from that, from the capitalist and often fascist associated, or just straight up fascists, that took over in the post-communist countries, where they would see this aspect of feminism as being a part of communism and something they need to reject. So a lot of the steps taken back have been directly, literally counter-revolutionary, in the sense of being counter to the revolution that brought these on. And it's just sickening to see now. It's just very frightening and sad, but there's still elements of it that have broken through, which are really good to see, to show that with the material conditions change, you can't just take all that back, at least not so quickly. So, for example, you have Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman in space. She was a Soviet cosmonaut, and she went to space. She went on a flight to space in 1969, 20 years before an American woman would go to space. And she afterwards became a politician, and she's still a politician in Russia now. So she's considered a national hero for the Russian people, and even for some of the people who still hold fond memories of the Soviet Union in the former Soviet republics. So that is a glimmer of hope that still remains. And with that, that's pretty much all I have in regards to the evidence. And there's many different examples. One thing I forgot to mention, that I wanted to mention in the discussion of religion, was in Cuba. And this is another great example of self-criticism and why self-criticism is so important to the party. For, I don't remember how many years, but you couldn't be a Christian and be in the Communist Party. And eventually that was corrected, and Castro personally felt responsible and apologized. And you can say an apology can only go so far, but that's an example of the party making a decision that is wrong and through democratic centralism correcting itself over time through a dialectical process where it's not all going to be solved immediately. Just like with the abortion issue, new ideas come to light. I mean, I can easily understand why in a country like Cuba, where the Catholic Church holds so much sway, they would be nervous about letting in Catholics into the organization. But even then, we weren't there at the time, so it's pointless to argue really about what should have been done or what could have been done. But looking at it now, we see Castro felt that it was wrong, or the Cuban Communist Party felt that it was wrong, and they have corrected that, and they've taken steps to reconcile the religious people of Cuba with the communist ideology. So that was just something I forgot to mention and wanted to bring up before I finish.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. I'm going to give the commencing closing statements. What do you have? Is anything? How do you want to close this out for the live stream?
Honestly, we hit all the nails on the head. We want more people to show up, of course, so we can have more topics of conversation and more dialogue going on. But it's always good to get our bases covered on the historical materialism of how a lot of this has arisen. And I think that Adam did a wonderful job of actually covering, a lot of where we stand and in concern with the history of a lot of these movements and with the history of these different oppressions, and getting all our ducks in a row is going to be immensely beneficial, and having this on record for us is going to be immensely beneficial in the future as well. So yeah, I mean, anybody watching now or later want to join in, you're absolutely always forever welcome. You don't need to be of any particular stripe, just come in and start a dialogue with us.
And that reminds me of, I was talking to my brother. I was surprised he didn't know I was a communist, because I pretty much made it obvious to him in other discussions, and I would openly read Marx in front of him. But I told him, and he was like, well, what about like freedom of religion, like letting people do their stuff? And I just pulled up pictures of churches in the DPRK and showed him, and like, look at this.
Yeah.
And, like, there was one article that was like, the North Korean priest has his church but like no congregation, and then the next image over is like a congregation in the same exact church. Like, you can see the paintings on the wall on the podium and the same guy. And yeah, I just wanted to connect, because this shouldn't just be a history class kind of lecture group. This needs to be connected with the modern movement. I wanted to connect those general ideas regarding religion, especially. Usually with women's rights, even liberals have a hard time criticizing communist countries in regards to that. Sometimes they'll go so far, they'll say they went too far, or really the only point they'll go at is Stalin made abortion illegal, which is such a there's so many things wrong with that statement, like he personally had a vendetta against abortion or something. But yeah, we just wanted to understand where the Marxist-Leninist movement as a whole stands in regards to these issues nowadays, and the state that the former communist countries are in now. So,
hooray! It's going to be saved for the future. Here we go.
you didn't get to give your gender theory.
That's okay.
Should we save that for later?
We'll save that for when we have people.